She was the last one standing in the room when the Queen took her final breath. She walked behind the coffin through the cold streets of Scotland without a single tear breaking past her composure. She carried her grief like armor, and she carried her loyalty like a crown. But when the lawyers finally opened the envelope, the one that had been sealed, locked, and protected from the world, Princess Anne said nothing. She simply left. And that silence, more than any statement she could have made, told the world everything it needed to know about a woman who had spent her entire life serving a mother, a monarch, and a family that the rest of the world would never truly understand. There is a particular kind of grief that does not weep. It does not reach for the nearest hand or search the crowd for someone to lean on. It stands upright. It keeps moving. It wears black, follows the coffin through ancient streets lined with thousands of strangers, and it does not allow itself the luxury of collapsing, not yet, not here, not in front of anyone. That is the grief Princess Anne carried through September 2022. And for those paying close enough attention, it told a far deeper story than anything the palace would ever officially release. Queen Elizabeth II died on the afternoon of September 8, 2022 at Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands. She was 96 years old and had reigned for 70 years, the longest-serving monarch in British history. The announcement came at 6:41 in the evening, London time. Within hours, the world had changed. A new king sat on the throne. An era had ended. And somewhere inside that great stone castle, surrounded by the hills and heather her mother had always loved, Princess Anne stood very, very still. What the world did not know in those first hours, what it would only learn later, piece by piece, through biographies and documentary interviews and the careful recollections of people who had been inside the walls, was just how much of the final chapter of Queen Elizabeth's life had been shaped by the one daughter she had. Not by the heir, not by the one who would become king, but by Anne. The woman who flew under the radar, the one the tabloids rarely celebrated, the one who had been working harder than almost any other royal for decades without demanding a single headline in return. Royal biographer Robert Hardman, whose extensive research brought many of these details to light, revealed that during the Queen's final summer at Balmoral, it was Princess Anne who stepped in to reassure her mother about a decision that had been quietly weighing on the elderly monarch. Queen Elizabeth had grown worried, in her own dignified way, about the logistics of dying far from London. Balmoral Castle sits deep in the Scottish Highlands, beautiful, remote, and a long way from the traditions and infrastructure that a royal death and state funeral would normally require. She was concerned that dying there would cause unnecessary difficulty for her family and for the nation. It was Anne who told her not to carry that worry. Anne who persuaded her that the rest of the family would handle whatever needed handling. Anne who, in the quiet and practical language she had always used with her mother, made it clear that staying in Scotland, in the place the Queen loved most in the world, was not a burden to anyone. It was a comfort. We did try to persuade her that she shouldn't be part of the decision-making process, Anne later said in a BBC documentary about King Charles's coronation year. It was a simple thing to say. But behind those words was a conversation between a mother and daughter that no camera had ever captured and no reporter had ever witnessed. And so the Queen stayed at Balmoral. She carried out what would be her final official engagement there on September 6, 2022, just 2 days before she died. She received incoming Prime Minister Liz Truss and accepted the resignation of Boris Johnson. It was a historic moment. For the first time in her 70-year reign, the Queen did not perform the transfer of prime ministerial power at Buckingham Palace. She did it from a drawing room in Scotland. Liz Truss later recalled that the Queen stood to greet her, that she was clearly not physically well, but that she spoke for around 20 minutes and remained entirely alert and focused. She was doing her job. To the very end, she was doing her job. 2 days later, she was gone. Princess Anne had not originally planned to be at Balmoral that day. She had been carrying out royal engagements in Scotland and stopped in on her way back south, what she would later describe as pure chance. "It was purely serendipity that I was there," she said. But serendipity, in this case, meant that of all the Queen's children, it was Anne who sat beside her mother in those final hours. It was Anne who was present when the call went out to Charles and the rest of the family to come quickly. It was Anne who witnessed, firsthand, what a private secretary's memo later described in 4 words: peaceful in her sleep. In the hours and days that followed, the world watched something remarkable. While King Charles was called to London to begin his duties as the new monarch, it fell to Princess Anne to stay with her mother, to accompany the Queen's coffin on its long, slow journey through Scotland. She walked behind the hearse through the villages of Royal Deeside, where thousands had gathered along the roadsides to watch and to weep. She stood in Edinburgh as the coffin was carried into St. Giles Cathedral. She curtsied as 8 kilted soldiers bore the heavy lead-lined casket through the doors. She held herself together with a kind of iron discipline that had become her defining characteristic over a lifetime of royal service. Dressed entirely in black, her face a controlled mask of grief, Anne followed her mother through Scotland for 3 days. Her sister-in-law Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, was seen gently placing a hand on Anne's back at one point, a small, human gesture in the middle of so much ceremony. It was one of the few cracks in the armor, but Anne did not stop. She kept walking. She kept standing. She kept doing what the Windsors have always done in public, which is to feel everything privately and show nothing that might frighten the watching world. She later wrote a statement that the palace published on the royal family's official social media. In it, she said she had been fortunate to share the last 24 hours of her mother's life and called it an honor and a privilege. She described watching the outpouring of love along the funeral route as both humbling and uplifting. She thanked the public for sharing in the family's grief. And then, very quietly, she said something else. She wrote that the world may have been reminded of how much of the Queen's contribution to national identity had been taken for granted. It was not quite an accusation. It was not quite a complaint. But it was honest in the way that Anne has always been honest, and it landed, for many people, like a quiet truth that had been waiting to be said. What nobody talked about publicly in those early weeks, what was still being processed in private, was the question of what came next. Not for the country, not for Charles, but for the family. For the children and grandchildren who had orbited the Queen for their entire lives, and who now had to figure out what they were to each other in a world where she was no longer the center of gravity. The Queen's will, the legal document that contained her final decisions about her estate, her personal possessions, and the distribution of a lifetime's worth of treasures, was sealed almost immediately. This was not a surprise. The practice of sealing royal wills dated back to 1910, when the will of Prince Francis of Teck was locked away to protect certain family secrets from public scrutiny. Since then, the wills of senior royals have been routinely sealed on the order of the High Court's Family Division, kept in a safe at an undisclosed location in London under the care of a judge. More than 30 such envelopes had accumulated over the decades, including the wills of the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret, both sealed in 2002. In February 2023, the President's Family Division issued a formal document updating the procedure for these sealed royal wills, introducing a 90-year time limit and a more transparent process for future cases. Under the new rules, an archivist would review a sealed will after 90 years, and a private determination would be made about whether it should be unsealed. 9 original wills were transferred to the Royal Archives for preservation. The court also directed that each sealing application must now include a closed judgment recording any confidential matters considered, a gesture toward transparency that changed very little about the fundamental reality. The Queen's will would not be read by the public. Not now, not in anyone's lifetime. What was known, however, came through other channels, through observation, through what people wore to official events, through the careful analysis of royal watchers who noticed which jewels had passed to which fingers. Princess Anne inherited her mother's iconic 3-strand pearl necklace, a piece of special significance because it had been a gift from the Queen's father, King George VI. Since George VI had died when Anne was just 1.5 years old, the necklace carried a double weight of connection. To a mother she had known all her life, and to a grandfather she had never had the chance to know. The pearl necklace was, in that sense, not just jewelry. It was a thread across generations. But the larger picture of the Queen's estate was dominated by the inheritance that passed to the new king. King Charles III became the primary beneficiary of his mother's personal assets. The properties, the investments, the art collection, the rare stamps, the horses, the personal items accumulated over a lifetime. The palaces, the crown jewels, the ceremonial objects, these were not personal property in any meaningful sense. They were held in trust for the crown and passed automatically from one sovereign to the next. The Queen's personal collection, however, the roughly 300 private pieces of jewelry alone, estimated at values running into hundreds of millions of pounds, was hers to distribute as she chose. And she had been thinking about it. In the months before her death, there had been quiet conversations and careful decisions. Sources close to the family had noted in the months before the Queen's passing that she had been reflecting on who deserved what, reviewing her beloved pieces and making arrangements. There were whispers of last-minute changes. There were rumors of surprises. The inheritance question had never been simple in the royal family, partly because of the complexities surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, who had stepped back from royal duties in 2020. Reports indicated that both Harry and Meghan were unlikely to receive significant portions of the Queen's personal estate. Harry had not been a beneficiary of the substantial legacy left by the Queen Mother. The pattern seemed to be continuing. The inheritance also carried a particular legal dimension that set it apart from ordinary wills. Under a 1993 agreement between the royal family and the British government, inheritances passing from one sovereign to the next were exempt from the standard 40% inheritance tax. This exemption existed specifically to prevent the erosion of royal wealth over generations, and applied only when the estate was transferred to the reigning monarch. The exemption did not apply to inheritance passing to other family members, meaning that Charles could receive the bulk of the estate tax-free, while the same assets in the hands of his siblings would carry significant tax liability. It was one of those invisible architectural features of royal finances that rarely made headlines but shaped everything. For Princess Anne, the practical reality may have meant receiving considerably less than her decades of service might have seemed to warrant. She had been widely recognized since 2021 as the hardest-working member of the British royal family, a title tracked through the court circular, the official record of royal engagements. She carried an extraordinary volume of duties. She attended more official engagements than any of her siblings, more than most working royals of any generation. She did so without complaint, without demands for recognition, and without the kind of media management that had become an art form for other members of the family. She simply worked, and then she worked some more. In January 2025, during a working visit to South Africa, her first international royal trip of the year, a journalist asked her whether she had any plans to retire. She answered in the way she answers most things, directly and without much decoration. "There is no retirement program on this particular life," she said. "It isn't an option." She was 74 years old. She had been thrown from a horse the previous summer, sustaining a concussion serious enough to require 5 nights in hospital. She had no memory of the accident. She did not know what she had been doing in the field. When she tried to think back to the moments before it happened, there was nothing there. And yet here she was, on another working trip in another country, doing another round of engagements, answering another journalist's question about when she was going to stop. She would not stop, she had said so clearly. And in saying so, she had also said something quieter, that this was not about duty as an obligation. It was about duty as identity. It was about who she was in a way that had no off switch. Her mother had been the same. The Queen had never retired either. Her final official engagement had taken place 2 days before she died. That is the inheritance that matters most in this family, not the jewelry, not the houses, not the sealed envelopes in the London safe. It is the understanding that the work does not end until you do. And so when the codicil was finally processed, when the lawyers handled the private paperwork, when the sealed documents were lodged with the relevant court, when the decisions the Queen had made in her final weeks were given their legal form, Princess Anne said nothing publicly. She did not speak to the press. She did not issue statements about what she had or had not received. She did not weigh in on the questions that commentators and royal watchers were asking about the fairness of royal inheritance law, about the tax exemptions, about the rumors and the speculation. She simply left the room. She went back to work. She attended the next engagement on her calendar and the one after that. She wore the pearl necklace her mother had left her, the one that connected her to a grandfather she had never known, and a mother she had spent 70 years watching. She wore it the way she carries everything, quietly, without explanation, without asking anyone whether they approved. There is a version of this story that would be easy to tell as a story of injustice. A daughter who gave more than anyone, who was present at the deathbed when the others were still on their way, who walked behind the coffin through Scotland while the new king was already assuming his throne, and who may have received far less in material terms than her service would seem to have earned. That version is not entirely wrong, but it is not the version that Princess Anne would recognize. The version she would recognize is simpler. A mother died. A daughter was there. The daughter walked her home. And then the daughter went back to work because that is what you do, and because that is who she is, and because some things in life are not measured in inheritance and sealed envelopes and the contents of royal safes. Some things are measured only in the quiet, unbroken record of showing up day after day, decade after decade, and refusing, against all evidence that it would cost you nothing to stop, to ever stop. That is the story of Princess Anne and the Queen's final codicil, not the document itself, not what it contained, but the silence that surrounded it and the woman who chose that silence over everything else the world was waiting to hear her say.